The racist cop arrested a black man for loitering. But when he opened the man's jacket, the summer heat shimmered off the asphalt of Main Street in the small town of Millbrook, casting a hazy glow over the sleepy storefronts and quiet sidewalk. Officer John Hawkins sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the sparse mid-afternoon traffic with a bored expression. At 43, John had been on the Millbrook police force for over 2 decades. Days like this, slow and uneventful, made him feel every one of those years. John's radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony. All units, we have a report of a suspicious individual near Thompson's Grocery on Oak Street. African-American male, mid-30s, wearing a hoodie. Caller says he's been loitering for the past hour. John straightened in his seat, feeling a familiar mix of anticipation and wariness course through him. Copy that, dispatch. Unit 17 responding. As John pulled away from the curb, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of something uncomfortable in the pit of his stomach. He'd grown up in Millbrook, a town that was still predominantly white, and while he'd never consider himself racist, he had black colleagues on the force, after all. Couldn't deny that calls like this always put him on edge. Arriving at Thompson's Grocery, John immediately spotted the man in question. He was leaning against the wall of the store, hood pulled up despite the heat, hands shoved deep in his pocket. John's training kicked in, noting the man's stance, the bulge in his jacket pocket. Be a weapon. Sir, John called out as he approached, one hand resting on his holster. I'm going to need you to take your hands out of your pockets slowly. The man turned, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. Is there a problem, officer? Just following up on a call, John replied, his voice tense. Can I see some ID, please? The man sighed, reaching for his back pocket. John's hand tightened on his gun, but the man merely pulled out a wallet. Look, I'm just waiting for my sister. She's inside shopping. I don't see how that's a crime. As John took the ID, he glanced at the name. Marcus Washington. The photo showed a clean-cut face, far cry from the scruffy, tired-looking man standing before him. But it was the military ID tucked behind the driver's license that caught John's attention. You're a veteran? John asked, surprise coloring his voice. Marcus nodded, a hint of pride breaking through his wary expression. 2 tours in Afghanistan, honorable discharge last year. Something shifted in John's perception, but old habits die hard. And what brings you to Millbrook, Mr. Washington? Like I said, my sister lives here. I'm staying with her while Marcus trailed off, seeming reluctant to continue. All you what? John pressed. Marcus met John's gaze, challenge in his eyes. While I get back on my feet, the transition back to civilian life hasn't been easy. John felt that uncomfortable twinge again, stronger this time. He'd had friends who'd served, knew the struggles many faced upon returning. But still, protocol was protocol. I'm going to need to pat you down, Mr. Washington. Standard procedure. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded, assuming the position without being told. As John began the pat-down, couldn't help but notice the stiff way Marcus held himself, the slight tremor in his hands. Are you carrying any weapons, Mr. Washington? No, sir, Marcus replied, his voice clipped. But as John's hand passed over the bulge in Marcus's jacket pocket, felt something hard and metallic. In a split second, training overrode everything else. John grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back, as he slammed him against the wall. Don't move, John shouted, reaching for his handcuffs. You're under arrest for carrying a concealed weapon and lying to an officer. What? No, Marcus yelled, struggling against John's grip. It's not a weapon, it's my med. But John wasn't listening. The adrenaline was pumping, the scene playing out just as it had in countless training scenarios. As he snapped the cuffs into place, a small crowd began to gather, murmurs of concern and disapproval rippling through the onlookers. It was only as John was reciting the Miranda rights that a woman's voice cut through the tension. Marcus, oh my God, what's happening? John looked up to see a middle-aged black woman rushing out of the store, grocery bags forgotten on the sidewalk. Her eyes were wide with fear and anger as she took in the scene. Ma'am, please step back, John ordered, but the woman ignored him, moving closer. That's my brother, she said, her voice shaking. He's a war hero. What are you doing? John felt the situation slipping out of his control. Ma'am, your brother was carrying a concealed weapon. A weapon? The woman interrupted, incredulous. The only thing he carries is his medication. Marcus, show him. John hesitated, then slowly reached into Marcus's pocket. What he pulled out wasn't a gun, but an EpiPen and an inhaler. The realization of what he'd done hit John like a physical blow. He jumped to conclusions, let his preconceptions guide his action. And now, with a crowd of angry onlookers and a wrongfully arrested veteran in handcuffs, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. As John fumbled with the handcuffs, trying to undo them with suddenly clumsy fingers, he could feel the weight of dozens of accusatory stares. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Racist cop," and others quickly took up the cry. Marcus rubbed his wrists as the cuffs came off, his expression a mixture of anger, hurt, and resignation. "Is this how you treat all veterans in Millbrook?" he asked quietly. "Or just the black one?" The question hit John like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, to apologize, to explain, but no words came out. What could he possibly say to make this right? As Marcus's sister wrapped a protective arm around her brother and led him away, John stood there, surrounded by the hostile crowd, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, on protecting and serving his community. But in this moment, he realized that his actions had done more to harm that community than any criminal he'd ever arrested. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of backup, but John knew that no amount of police presence could fix what had just happened. As he watched Marcus and his sister disappear around the corner, John Hawkins came to a painful realization. If he wanted to truly serve and protect all members of his community, he had a lot of soul-searching and learning to do. Little did he know, this incident would be the catalyst for a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his job, and the community he had sworn to protect. The following days were a blur of activity and emotion for Officer John Hawkins. The incident outside Thompson's grocery had exploded across social media, with shaky cell phone footage of Marcus's arrest going viral within hours. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon Millbrook found itself at the center of a national conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. John sat in Chief Bennett's office, his shoulders slumped as he listened to the older man's exasperated sigh. "You really stepped in it this time, Hawkins," Chief said, rubbing his temples. "The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. We've got protesters outside the station, and the Washington family is threatening to sue." "I know, Chief," John replied, his voice hollow. "I messed up, bad." Chief Bennett leaned back in his chair, fixing John with a hard stare. "You're suspended without pay for 2 weeks, pending a full investigation, and when you come back, you're going to undergo extensive sensitivity training. Understood?" John nodded, accepting the punishment without argument. As he left the station, slipping out the back to avoid the crowd of protesters at the front, he felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He'd always thought of himself as one of the good guys. Now, at home, things weren't much better. His wife, Sarah, was supportive but clearly troubled by the incident. Their teenage daughter, Emma, had barely spoken to him since the news broke, her silence a painful indictment of his action. It was Emma who finally broke the tension, cornering John in the kitchen one evening. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "how could you do that? Marcus is Tanya's uncle. You know, Tanya from my class? She's devastated." The realization that his actions had directly affected someone in his daughter's life hit John hard. He sank into a chair, feeling the weight of his mistake even more acutely. I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted. "I made a terrible judgment call. I let my biases get the better of me." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You always taught me to treat everyone equally. Was that all just talk?" Her words cut deep, forcing John to confront the disconnect between his professed beliefs and his actions. As Emma left the room, John knew he had to do more than just serve out his suspension. He needed to make real, meaningful changes, not just for his career, for his family and his community. The next day, John made a decision that surprised even himself. He reached out to Marcus Washington's sister, Angela, requesting a meeting. To his shock, she agreed. The local diner was nearly empty when John arrived, save for Angela sitting in a corner booth. Her expression was guarded as John approached, and he could feel the weight of her judgment as he slid into the seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mrs. Johnson," John began, his voice earnest. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you or your brother, but I need to apologize. What I did was inexcusable." Angela studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're right. It was inexcusable. Do you know what you did to my brother? Marcus has PTSD from his time in Afghanistan. Actions that day triggered a severe episode. He's been hospitalized." John felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't cut it, Officer Hawkins," Angela replied, her voice hard. "My brother served this country with honor, only to come home and be treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. How do you think that makes him feel? How do you think it makes our community feel?" As Angela continued to speak, detailing the fear and frustration that she and other people of color in Millbrook experienced on a daily basis, John listened with growing horror and shame. He'd always prided himself on protecting his community, but he was now forced to confront the fact that a significant portion of that community lived in fear of the very institution he represented. "What can I do?" John asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can I make this right?" Angela's expression softened slightly, the genuine remorse in John's voice. "You can start by educating yourself. Really educating yourself, not just sitting through some mandated sensitivity training. And then you can use your position to make real changes in your department." She reached into her bag and pulled out a book, sliding it across the table to John. Title read, "The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness," by Michelle Alexander. "Read this," Angela said. "It's a start, and when you're done, if you're serious about making changes, come talk to me again." The community center where I work is always looking for officers willing to engage in real dialogue with the people they're supposed to protect and serve. As John left the diner, the book clutched in his hand, felt a mix of emotions: shame, determination, and a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he had a path forward. Over the next 2 weeks, John threw himself into learning. He read not just the book Angela had given him, but others as well. He watched documentaries, attended online seminars, and engaged in difficult conversations with his family about race and privilege. The more he learned, the more John realized how much he had been blind to. The systemic inequalities, the daily microaggressions, the generational trauma, it was overwhelming. But instead of discouraging him, this knowledge fueled his determination to do better. When his suspension ended, John returned to the force a changed man. He approached Chief Bennett with a list of proposals: increased community engagement initiatives, implicit bias training for all officers, a citizen review board for use of force incidents. The chief was skeptical at first, but John's passion was contagious. "You really believe in this, don't you, Hawkins?" he asked, studying John closely. "I do, sir," John replied firmly. "I've seen the harm that our blind spots can cause. We need to do better. We have to do better." With the chief's cautious approval, John began to implement his ideas. It wasn't easy. He faced resistance from some of his fellow officers, skepticism from community members, and his own moments of doubt and frustration. But he persevered, driven by the memory of Marcus's face and the determination to live up to the ideals he had always claimed to uphold. One of John's initiatives was a series of community dialogue sessions, where officers and residents could engage in open, honest conversations about their experiences and perceptions. It was at one of these sessions, about a month after his return to duty, that John came face to face with Marcus Washington for the first time since the arrest. The community center was packed, the atmosphere tense as John took his place at the front of the room. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes locked with Marcus's. The veteran's gaze was hard, challenging, but he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. John took a deep breath and began to speak. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm here to listen, to learn, and to commit to doing better. What happened to Mr. Washington was a failure, not just on my part, but on the part of a system that allowed my biases to go unchecked for far too long." As the session progressed, community members shared their stories. experiences of racial profiling, feeling unsafe in their own neighborhoods, the fear they felt every time they saw a police car in their rearview mirror. John listened to each one, really listened, feeling the weight of their words and the responsibility he bore to change things. When Marcus finally stood to speak, the room fell silent. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I served my country because I believed in what it could be, not what it was. When Officer Hawkins arrested me that day, it felt like a betrayal of everything I'd fought for." John felt each word like a physical blow, but he forced himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "But," Marcus continued, "I've been watching what's been happening here over the past month. The changes being made, the conversations being had. It's not enough, not yet, but it's a start." He turned to face John directly. "Officer Hawkins, I don't forgive you. Not yet. But I see that you're trying to make things right. Keep doing that. Not just for me, but for every person of color in this community who deserves to feel safe and respected." As the session ended, John approached Marcus, hand extended. After a moment's hesitation, Marcus shook it. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite, but it was a beginning. As John drove home that night, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. He knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult. Changing ingrained attitudes and systemic problems wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in his career, John felt like he was truly living up to his oath, protect and serve, not just some of his community, but all of it. The racist cop who had arrested a black veteran was gone. In his place was a man committed to growth, to change, and to the hard work of building a more just and equitable system. It wasn't a dramatic transformation that would make headlines, but it was real, was ongoing, and it had the potential to create lasting change in Millbrook and beyond. As John pulled into his driveway, he saw Emma waiting for him on the porch. The look of pride in her eyes as he approached told him that he was on the right path. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. The real work was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the incident that had changed Officer John Hawkins' life and shaken the town of Millbrook to its core. In that time, John had worked tirelessly to implement changes within the police department and build bridges with the community. Progress was slow but steady, with small victories accumulating over time. However, tensions in Millbrook remained high. The lawsuit filed by the Washington family was still pending, and every interaction between the police and the community seemed to carry the weight of decades of mistrust and misunderstanding. It was against this backdrop that Millbrook faced its greatest challenge yet. Peaceful protest organized by local activists, including Angela Johnson, was planned in front of the police station. The demonstration was meant to commemorate the 6-month anniversary of Marcus's arrest and call for further reforms in the police department. John, now serving as the department's community liaison, had worked closely with the organizers to ensure the protest would remain peaceful and that police presence would be minimal and non-confrontational. However, as the day approached, reports began to circulate of outside agitators planning to hijack the event. The morning of the protest dawned tense and humid. John arrived at the station early, his stomach churning with anxiety. As he entered the briefing room, he could feel the nervous energy radiating from his fellow officers. Chief Bennett stood at the front of the room, his face grim. "All right, people, listen up. We've got credible intel that some out-of-town troublemakers are planning to turn this peaceful protest into a riot. Our job is to make sure that doesn't happen." John felt a chill run down his spine. This was exactly the kind of situation that could undo all the progress they'd made. He raised his hand. "Chief, with all due respect, a heavy police presence might escalate tensions. We've been working with the organizers." "I know what you've been doing, Hawkins," Chief interrupted, "and I appreciate it. But we can't take chances. We're going with the full riot gear deployment." John's heart sank as he watched his colleagues don their heavy protective gear and pick up their riot shields. This was all wrong. He had to do something. As the protesters began to gather outside, John made a decision that he knew could cost him his job. He approached Angela, who was helping to organize the crowds. "Angela," he said urgently, "we've got a problem. The department's planning a full riot gear response, I'm afraid things could get out of hand quickly." Angela's eyes widened in alarm. "But we had an agreement. This is supposed to be a peaceful demonstration." "I know," John replied. "But there are rumors of outside agitators. Listen, I have an idea, but I'm going to need your help." Together, John and Angela quickly spread the word among the protest leaders and the police officers they trusted most. As the crowd grew and tensions began to mount, their plan went into action. Just as it seemed, the situation might tip into chaos, with riot-geared officers facing off against increasingly agitated protesters. Something unexpected happened. John, along with a group of officers who had removed their riot gear, stepped out from behind the police line. At the same time, Angela and several other community leaders moved to the front of the protest crowd. In a moment that would later be captured in a photograph shared around the world, John and Angela met in the middle of the street, directly between the two groups. They clasped hands, raised them above their heads, and began to walk together towards the steps of the police station. A hush fell over the crowd as John reached for the megaphone at his hip. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the tense silence. "Today we stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "We can choose the path of division, of fear, of violence. Or we can choose a different way, a way of understanding, of growth, of coming together despite our differences." Angela took the megaphone next. "We are here today, not as enemies, but as members of the same community. We all want the same thing, a safe, just, and equitable Millbrook for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin." As they spoke, something remarkable began to happen. Other officers, moved by John's example, began to remove their riot gear. Protesters lowered their signs. The invisible barrier between the two groups began to dissolve. Watching from the sidelines, Marcus Washington felt a complex mix of emotions. He had come to the protest filled with anger and resentment. Seeing John and his sister standing together, he felt something shift inside him. Making a split-second decision, Marcus stepped forward. As he approached John and Angela, the crowd parted, a ripple of recognition passing through them. John's eyes widened in surprise as Marcus joined them on the steps. Taking the megaphone, Marcus addressed the crowd. "6 months ago, I was wrongfully arrested on these very steps," began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was angry. I wanted justice. I wanted revenge." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, black, white, brown uniforms and civilians alike. "But standing here today, I realize that true justice isn't about punishment. It's about change. Real, lasting change." Marcus turned to John, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. "Officer Hawkins made a terrible mistake that day, but in the months since, I've watched him work tirelessly to make amends, not just to me, but to our entire community. He's shown that people can change, that institutions can change. We're willing to do the hard work." As Marcus spoke, tension in the air seemed to dissipate. Protesters and police officers alike listened intently, many nodding in agreement. "We have a long way to go," Marcus continued. "The road ahead won't be easy, but if we can stand here today, together, then I believe anything is possible." As Marcus finished speaking, something extraordinary happened. Slowly at first, then with growing momentum, protesters and police officers began to mingle. Conversations broke out, hesitant at first, then more animated. Years of mistrust didn't disappear in an instant. Bridges were being built, one interaction at a time. John, Angela, and Marcus stood together on the steps, watching in awe as the scene unfolded before them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still tense moments, heated arguments, and a few arrests of those intent on causing trouble. But the widespread violence and chaos that had been feared never materialized. As the day wore on, the protest transformed into something more like a community forum. Officers and citizens engaged in frank, often difficult conversations about race, policing, and justice. Plans were made for future meetings, committees formed to address specific issues. As the sun began to set, John found himself face to face with Chief Bennett. He braced himself for a reprimand, but to his surprise, the chief's expression was one of grudging respect. "That was one hell of a risk you took today, Hawkins," Bennett said gruffly. "Could have gone south real fast." John nodded, standing his ground. "Yes, sir, but I believed it was necessary." Chief was quiet for a moment, surveying the scene around them. Finally, he spoke again. You know, when I first put on this badge, I thought our job was to impose order. But watching this today, maybe our real job is to build trust. John felt a surge of hope at the chief's words. Does this mean you'll support continuing the reform initiatives? Bennett sighed. There was a hint of a smile on his face. Let's just say I'm open to discussion. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. As the crowd began to disperse, John found himself standing with Marcus and Angela. The three of them looked at each other, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration on their faces. So, John said hesitantly, where do we go from here? Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. Forward, said simply. Together. Angela nodded in agreement. This is just the beginning, but it's a good beginning. As they stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in brilliant hues, John Hawkins felt a profound sense of change, not just in his community, but in himself. The journey that had begun with a mistake born of prejudice had led to this moment of unity and hope. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more hard conversations and difficult decisions. The work of building a truly just and equitable society was far from over. But for the first time, John felt like it was truly possible. The racist cop who had arrested a black veteran was gone. In his place stood a man committed to justice, to understanding, and to the ongoing work of bringing his community together. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood ending, but it was real. It was powerful, and it held the promise of lasting change. As John looked out over the dispersing crowd, at the mingling of uniforms and civilians, at the conversation still going on, he knew that this was what it meant to truly protect and serve. Not through force or fear, through understanding, empathy, and a commitment to doing better every single day. The real work was just beginning, but together they were ready to face it head-on. In the weeks following the transformative protest, Millbrook found itself in a state of cautious optimism. Dramatic events of that day had captured national attention, with news outlets hailing it as a model for community police reconciliation. For those on the ground, the real work was just beginning. John Hawkins sat in Chief Bennett's office, nervously fidgeting with his badge as the chief reviewed the latest proposal for departmental reforms. Citizen Oversight Committee, expanded de-escalation training, community service requirements for all officers, Bennett muttered as he flipped through the pages. Finally, he looked up at John, his expression unreadable. You really think we can pull all this off, Hawkins? John straightened in his chair. I do, sir. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I believe it's necessary if we want to truly serve and protect everyone in this community. Bennett was quiet for a long moment, and nodded slowly. All right, Hawkins, you've got my support. But I'm holding you personally responsible for making this work. As John left the chief's office, he felt a mix of elation and trepidation. He had the green light to implement real changes, but he knew that the hardest part was still to come. Changing policies was one thing, changing hearts and minds was quite another. Over the next few months, John threw himself into the work of reform. He organized training sessions, facilitated community dialogues, and worked tirelessly to build trust between the police department and the citizens they served. It wasn't always easy. Some of his fellow officers resisted the changes, seeing them as an admission of guilt or a capitulation to outside pressure. John found himself having difficult conversations nearly every day, challenging long-held beliefs and ingrained behaviors. One particularly tough moment came during a de-escalation training session. Officer Mike Branson, a veteran cop known for his aggressive tactics, was openly skeptical of the new approaches being taught. This is all well and good in theory, Branson scoffed, but when you're out there on the streets, sometimes you need to show force to maintain control. John took a deep breath, recognizing the critical nature of this moment. Mike, I used to think the same way. But let me ask you this. How many times has showing force actually de-escalated a situation? How many times has it made things worse? He went on to share stories from his own experience, as well as data showing the effectiveness of de-escalation technique. By the end of the session, while Branson wasn't fully convinced, he was at least willing to give the new methods a try. These small victories kept John going, even on the toughest days. But it was his evolving relationship with Marcus Washington that truly marked the progress being made. What had started as a traumatic encounter had slowly transformed into a tentative partnership. Marcus, still dealing with the aftermath of his PTSD episode triggered by the arrest, had initially been hesitant to engage with John beyond the necessary interaction. But as he saw the genuine efforts being made to change the police department, he found himself drawn into the process. One sunny afternoon, John received an unexpected call from Marcus. "Officer Hawkins," Marcus said, his voice hesitant but determined, "I've been thinking about your community outreach program. I have some ideas I'd like to discuss, if you're willing to listen." John felt a surge of hope at Marcus's words. "Of course, Marcus. I'd be honored to hear your thoughts." They met at the local community center where Marcus shared his vision for a program that would bring together veterans and police officers for mutual support and understanding. Many of us struggle with similar issues: PTSD, reintegration into civilian life, the weight of serving in a position of authority. I think if we could create a space for dialogue and shared experiences, it could benefit everyone. John was impressed by the depth of thought Marcus had put into the idea. Together, they began to flesh out the details of what would eventually become the Guardians United program. As the program took shape, John was constantly amazed by Marcus's insights and dedication. The man he had once wrongly judged as a threat was proving to be one of the most valuable allies in the fight for positive change. The launch of Guardians United marked a significant milestone in Millbrook's journey towards healing and reform. First meeting was held in the very community center where John and Marcus had first begun to work together. As John looked around the room, seeing police officers and veterans engaged in earnest conversation, he felt a profound sense of how far they had come. But it was Marcus's opening speech that truly drove home the magnitude of the change. "6 months ago, I stood on the steps of the police station, angry and hurt, calling for justice," Marcus began, his voice strong and clear. "Today, I stand here with a different purpose, not to demand change, but to be part of creating it." He went on to speak about the importance of understanding, of seeing beyond uniforms and labels to the human beings underneath. As he concluded, he turned to John. "Officer Hawkins and I started our journey as adversaries. Today, I'm proud to call him a partner in this work, and I hope that one day, I'll be able to call him a friend." The room erupted in applause, and John felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something equally powerful: hope. As the months passed, Millbrook began to see tangible results from its reform efforts. Use of force incidents decreased dramatically. Community satisfaction with police interactions improved. The department began to see an increase in applications from people of color, drawn by the promise of a more equitable and community-oriented approach to policing. But perhaps the most significant change was in the day-to-day interactions between police and citizens. Officers were more likely to be seen chatting with residents, participating in community events, and engaging in the kind of positive, non-enforcement interactions that built trust and understanding. 1 year to the day after the initial incident, John found himself back at Thompson's grocery. This time, he wasn't responding to a call, but participating in a community outreach event. As he helped bag groceries and chatted with customers, caught sight of a familiar face. Marcus Washington stood in the doorway, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. John excused himself and walked over, feeling a mix of nervousness and hope. "Officer Hawkins?" Marcus greeted him, extending his hand. "John, please," John replied, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. Marcus nodded, then gestured to the busy store around them. "Quite a different scene from a year ago." "Indeed it is," John agreed. "Marcus, I know I've said it before, but I want to apologize again for—" Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. "John, I didn't come here for another apology. I came to say thank you." John blinked in surprise. "Thank me? For what?" "For showing me that people can change, that institutions can change. A year ago, I wouldn't have believed it was possible. But watching you, seeing the work you've put in, the risks you've taken, it's given me hope." John felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Marcus. Your willingness to engage, to share your perspective, it's made all the difference." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, voice softer. You know, when I was in Afghanistan, I had a commanding officer who always used to say, the true measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Think about that a lot. He met John's gaze, eyes filled with a mix of emotions. You fell, John, but you got back up, and you've been helping others get up ever since. That counts for something. As they stood there in the doorway of the store where their journey had begun a year ago, both men felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. There was still work to be done, trust to be built, systems to be changed. But it was a real and powerful testament to the possibility of growth, redemption, and positive change. So, John said after a moment, what's next? Marcus smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. Well, the Guardians United program is looking to expand to neighboring counties. I could use some help with the outreach. Interested? John felt a surge of excitement at the prospect. Absolutely. Partners? Marcus nodded, extending his hand once more. Partners. As they shook hands, both men knew that their work was far from over. The journey of reform, of building true equity and justice, was ongoing. But they were no longer walking that path as officer and suspect, or even as reformer and advocate. They were walking it as friends, as partners, as two men committed to creating a better world, one interaction at a time. As John returned to his community outreach duties and Marcus left to prepare for their next project, both carried with them a profound sense of hope. The racist cop who had arrested a black veteran was gone, replaced by a man dedicated to justice and understanding. And the veteran who had been wrongly arrested was now a powerful voice for change and reconciliation. Their story, which had begun with a moment of prejudice and fear, had transformed into a testament to the power of growth, empathy, and the unyielding human capacity for change. It wasn't the end of their journey, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. One filled with challenges, certainly, but also with the promise of a more just and equitable future for all. 5 years had passed since that fateful day outside Thompson's grocery. Millbrook had changed in ways that once seemed impossible, becoming a model for police reform and community engagement across the nation. On a warm summer evening, the town square was alive with activity. Families picnicked on the grass, children played, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and music. The center of it all stood a new monument, a simple stone pillar with a plaque that read, "Dedicated to second chances and new beginnings." John Hawkins, now the chief of police, stood before the gathered crowd, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor relaxed and approachable. Beside him was Marcus Washington, looking healthy and at peace, his PTSD managed through the support systems they had built together. 5 years ago, John began, his voice carrying across the square, I made a mistake that could have torn this community apart. But instead, thanks to the courage and compassion of people like Marcus Washington, became the catalyst for transformative change. He gestured to the diverse group before him, officers mingling freely with citizens, children of all races playing together, elderly residents engaged in conversation with teenage volunteers. Look around you. This is what's possible when we choose understanding over fear, growth over stagnation, and unity over division. Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on John's shoulder. What happened here in Millbrook isn't a fairy tale, he added. It's been hard work. There have been setbacks, disagreements, moments of doubt, but we've persevered because we believe in the power of community, in the possibility of change, and in the fundamental dignity of every human being. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, John and Marcus unveiled a new sign at the entrance to the police station. Read, "To protect, serve, and understand." Crowd erupted in applause, not just for the sign, for everything it represented. The journey they had all taken together, the bridges that had been built, the wounds that had begun to heal. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, John and Marcus found themselves sitting on a park bench, watching as the last stragglers made their way home. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, when I was in the military, we had a saying, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. John nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "I think we've both been measured in ways we never expected," he replied. Marcus smiled, a gesture that had become much more frequent over the years. "And we're still standing. Not just standing, growing, learning, moving forward." As they sat there, two men who had started as adversaries and become the unlikeliest of friends, they felt a profound sense of hope for the future. The work wasn't over. It never would be. But they had proven that change was possible, that healing could happen, that a single moment of crisis could be transformed into a lifetime of positive action. The story that had begun with racist cop arrests black military veteran had evolved into something far more powerful. Testament to the human capacity for growth, the strength found in unity, and the transformative power of understanding. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, John and Marcus stood, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. They had learned that the most important changes don't always make headlines, but they do change hearts, minds, and communities. And in Millbrook, a town that had become a beacon of hope for so many, real work, the daily effort of building a more just and equitable world, continued on.